Hello, everybody. I'm Ed Robinson, and welcome to another exciting edition of At the Rim. This is the program that gets you caught up on anything and everything happening around the NBA. We've got a lot to get to on this edition of the program. We have interviews with LaurenGunn and Nick Agar-Johnson. Lauren is an NBA collaboration partner with Bleacher Report. We discussed the Mavericks' performance in the Western Conference Finals against the Minnesota Timberwolves. Also, we discussed head coach Jason Kidd, Kyrie Irving, Luka Doncic, the city of Dallas and their response to the Mavericks being in the NBA Finals, and much more. As for Nick, he is the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, and editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Of course, on the program, Nick and I, we preview this year's NBA Finals matchup between the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the program. I want to start off with my top three storylines. Got to start off with a developing story out on the West Coast, with the Los Angeles Lakers. DanHurley, currently at the moment, is the head coach of the University of Connecticut, the UConn men's basketball program. I mean, what a college career he has thus far. 2 national championships. I mean, the way that he's put recruits together at UConn and continuing to make it a solid program is phenomenal. Well, according to ESPN's Adrian Wojnarowski and other NBA sources, Hurley has been offered a massive deal by the Los Angeles Lakers. According to those sources, Hurley has been offered a deal that cannot be refused. And again, when we talk about the Los Angeles Lakers and specifically the head coaching candidates for this head coaching vacancy, J.J. Redick was at the top of the list. Also, Sam Cassell, James Borrego, and other candidates are in the running for the Los Angeles Lakers head coaching job. And now you add DanHurley to the list as well. And from what the reports about Hurley being made an offer that by the Lakers that he cannot refuse, this is certainly interesting. When you think about the Los Angeles Lakers, one of the storied franchises in all of professional sports, you think about the Lakers being up there with the Celtics, with the Dallas Cowboys, just with those storied franchises, not just with winning championships, but also just the allure of putting on that Laker uniform and with the countless Hall of Famers with that organization like Magic and Kareem and Elgin Baylor and Jerry West and also Shaquille O'Neal, the late, great Kobe Bryant. The Lakers, right? The Lakers, there have been moments, I remember when the Lakers were not winning, but just the idea of being in Los Angeles, the entertainment capital of the world, one of the crown jewels, and not just the West Coast, but all of the world, just the allure of being in L.A. It's something to think about, but also something to think about as well as a program that has been built under Hurley's administration at UConn. You have to remember, L.A., major world-class city. Storrs, Connecticut, where the University of Connecticut is, small college town. So it's all eyes and ears are on the University of Connecticut. Now, there's more stresses in being a college coach. Remember, you have to go and recruit young men for your program, not to mention you're dealing with NIL, transfer portal. All that makes a huge difference. But if the Lakers are making him an offer, and let's just say in the offer, he'll bring his staff, he'll have more of a flexibility when it comes to hiring and firing and having a say-so in terms of not just with his staff and front office decisions, but also 2 future Hall of Famers, Anthony Davis and, of course, LeBron James. And then with this pending NBA draft dealing with Bronny, you know, DanHurley, highly respected, one of the great college coaches, and he did say if the offer was right, he would entertain an offer from the NBA. And again, being in Los Angeles, and you know, that's it's something that's it's hard to pass up. And there's going to be a lot of decisions in the Hurley household just in terms of laying down roots, going from East Coast to West Coast. Both DanHurley, along with his wife, they both grew up on the East Coast. The culture of the East Coast, having to recalibrate their lives, go out to the West Coast. But from what sources are saying, it's saying that the Lakers are making him an offer that is blockbuster and he cannot refuse. That's it's something to think about, considering one of those storied franchises, not just in the NBA, but in all of professional sports. If he goes to the Lakers, it would be great. If he goes back to UConn, it would be great as well, because he can continue building a legacy amongst the college ranks. And also, too, despite with the transfer portal and the NIL, he can still capitalize because UConn has that college basketball pedigree. But the Los Angeles Lakers, man, you know, just being in Los Angeles alone, so many opportunities would open up. But that's the latest news involving the Los Angeles Lakers. All right, my second storyline is going to be the 2024 NBA Finals, and I think we're in for a treat. We are going to have a sensational matchup between the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics. So with the Mavericks and the Celtics, you've got two high-profile coaches, Joe Mazzulla for the Celtics, Jason Kidd for the Dallas Mavericks. Jason Kidd got a contract extension not long ago, so he's excited about that, but I know he's even more excited about being in the finals. And we'll get into the previews of the matchups with Nick Agar-Johnson in just a little bit, but the 2024 NBA Finals are here between the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics, and we had a long wait. both series, both Eastern Conference and Western Conference Final series, both ended early. Boston sweeping the Indiana Pacers, the Dallas Mavericks beating the Minnesota Timberwolves in a 5-game series, and both matchups ending early, so we had a little time to wait patiently, and now the series is finally here, and I think it's going to be exciting. I think it's going to be a one-of-a-kind series between not just the duos with Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, but also with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And certainly the 2024 NBA Finals, we had to wait a while for it, but guess what? It's here, and I definitely cannot wait. And for my last storyline, it is going to be the Mavericks and the Celtics. So the Mavericks, we know about their impact players. The Celtics, we know about their impact players. But for Dallas and Boston, I think it's going to be coming down to the duos. Luka Doncic, Kyrie Irving, and Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Luka and Kyrie have both had a playoff run for the ages. Kyrie, I guess you could say he's on a redemption tour. After what happened, the 2 years he played in Boston, said he was going to sign an extension. Then he leaves and wants to go to Brooklyn. He winds up going to Brooklyn. We know how that turned out and all the stuff that came with it. But Kyrie has re-energized himself in this redemption tour. Kyrie has just had a playoff run for the ages. As for Luka Doncic, listen, Luka being Luka and trash and backing it up. Ask the Minnesota Timberwolves. I mean, knocking down three-pointers, including the game winner in Game 2 of that series. Luka has just been automatic since he's been in the NBA, and this year's playoff run has been nothing short of magnificent for the gentleman from Slovenia. So we got Luka and Kyrie going up against Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Both of these brothers are skilled. Both of these brothers are so strong offensively, and both of these brothers can play defense. Kyrie, a solid defender. Luka, not known for his defense, but Jason and Jaylen are both great two-way players. Both gentlemen can shoot like nobody's business, and both brothers can defend very well. And they're versatile defenders. You can put them at the forward position, they hold their own. You can put them at the guard position, and they hold their own as well. And again, these two duos are so unique, but they're both very effective. You've got one duo that's been together only for a short period of time, and they're still trying to gel, but this is the playoffs. This is the season, really, since the trade deadline, that they've really put everything together. As for another duo, the chemistry is there. They've been together. They know what's up. They don't have to say much to one another because they know what the other is thinking. So this is going to be fantastic. This is going to be great. All of the impact players are going to be involved in this series, but we know in the end it could come down to the play of the two duos in Dallas with Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving, and for the Boston Celtics, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. All right, those are my top three storylines. And quickly, before we go to our break and then we get into our first interview, JBBickerstaff fired by the Cleveland Cavaliers. Bickerstaff was the head coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers for 5 seasons. Not a fan of this move. I'm really disappointed behind this move. I know his first 3 seasons with the Cavaliers, the team missed the playoffs. Not this year, but last season, the 2022-2023 season, the Cavaliers lost in the first round in a tough series against the New York Knicks. And then this year, they made it to the second round in the conference semifinals, losing a tough one to the Boston Celtics. So I thought Bickerstaff should have been returned. For the Cavs, should have returned to Cleveland for at least 1, maybe 2 more years, but we'll see how the coaching search ends up for Cleveland, and then also the future of Donovan Mitchell. Will he be in Cleveland for the long term, or will he stay 1 more year, maybe 2 more years, and then exercise his right as a free agent? I know about the player option, so we'll see about that. But again, after 5 seasons as the head coach of the Cleveland Cavaliers, JBBickerstaff is fired. So we've already opened up the show talking about the Los Angeles Lakers coaching search, or head coaching search for that matter. Now the Cleveland Cavaliers are searching for their new head coach as JBBickerstaff is let go. The NBA Finals are here, and we have our 2 teams that are going to be representing proudly for the Eastern Conference, the Boston Celtics, and for the Western Conference, the Dallas Mavericks. And when you talk about the Dallas Mavericks, they were certainly the hottest team in the NBA during the second half of the year, especially when the trade deadline happened. They made some key moves, acquiring guys like Daniel Gafford, also P.J. Washington, of course, the duo, right, Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. They handled their business, especially going into the playoff run. To talk more about the Mavericks' performance in the Western Conference Finals and then being in the NBA Finals to take on the Boston Celtics, let's welcome her back to the program. She is an NBA collaboration partner with Bleacher Report and a diehard Dallas Mavericks fan. Let's welcome her back to the program, LaurenGunn. Hey, Lauren, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be talking hoops this late into the year. It's been a minute for Dallas since that's been the case, and there's a lot to be excited about. So thank you for having me back.
Oh, you're welcome. And again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be on the program. And you're right, Lauren. It's always fun to talk hoops this late in the year, especially when your team is in the thick of things and going to be playing in the NBA Finals. So, Lauren, what a difference a year makes. Last year, Dallas just had they had a fall from grace. They had a chance to possibly qualify for the play-in tournament last year. It didn't happen. They went on a massive losing streak. And this year, the trade deadline, they got it in order, acquiring P.J. Washington and also Daniel Gafford, and along with Luka, Kyrie, Derek Lively. Also, when you have Derek Jones Jr. and company, those guys really made the difference. So I know it was a shocker to a lot of us that the Mavericks would win the Western Conference Finals, beating the Minnesota Timberwolves. But give me your thoughts overall on the performance, on how the Mavs did in beating the Minnesota Timberwolves to become the Western Conference champions.
Yeah, I mean, the series against Minnesota was an interesting one. I think going into it, a lot of people that were following the Mavs closely felt confident in their ability to win the series because of Dallas proving throughout the season, but then also kind of coming into the playoffs, playing in those first 2 rounds to very different teams in the Clippers and OKC. And so going against those 2 teams that have very different identities, very different physical makeups and knowing how you fared against them. Going against a team like Minnesota, who very talented, very, very tough defense, but when they have the bigs that maybe struggle to defend in space, and then they have a primary defender in Jaden McDaniels, and even guys that support Jaden McDaniels and Nickeil Alexander-Walker and Kyle Anderson that have a thinner frame than someone like Lou Dort, who we saw how much that physicality that Dort played with impacted Luka. I mean, there's only so much you can slow down Luka, but when you have a bigger frame versus someone who maybe has more length than they do thickness, I guess would be the word, that kind of plays into Luka's favor a little bit. So going into that series, that was something that I was keeping an eye on in terms of looking at how Luka targeting bigs that aren't as great playing in space as obviously their perimeter defenders are, and then also just the overall impact of going up against defenders that are thinner than as opposed to someone like Lou Dort. So this matchup against Boston is obviously going to be very different, kind of trending back in that direction of someone more similar to Lou Dort. But going up against Minnesota, that was a good test for Dallas. That was the first time they had been outmatched in terms of interior physical presence. And so for them to kind of pick and choose which ways they wanted to attack that and then be able to dominate the series the way that they did and win in 5 was huge for them. Huge for the confidence, huge for getting a week off before the finals. There were so many things about that really bode well for Dallas and was huge for them. But, yeah, it wasn't an easy series. It was one that each game was only separated by a couple of points. So even though it felt like Dallas dominated in the way that they ended that series, it was still close in a lot of ways. So props to Dallas for closing it in 5. But, yeah, I think that this next test is going to be very different.
Yeah, and certainly we saw the future of the NBA. Well, one of the future stars of the NBA with in the Western Conference Finals series with Anthony Edwards. He definitely has a bright future, definitely ahead of him. It won't be the last time we'll see him in a playoff run. And I wanted to stay with Dallas's victory in the Western Conference Finals over the Minnesota Timberwolves. Mm-hmm. I mentioned the trade deadline was big for Dallas. They were the hottest team in the second half of the year, and especially acquiring Daniel Gafford and P.J. Washington. How big, Lauren, were those acquisitions of getting Gafford and Washington in the trade deadline and setting the tone for Dallas's playoff run?
Yeah, I mean, they were huge. I think for Dallas, kind of backtracking a bit coming into this season when having Derek Lively was obviously a huge plus, having that size, that athleticism, that vertical threat was something that they hadn't had. So that alone was already a big change. But then, again, when you have a rookie center, you can only sort of expect so much. And straight out of the gate, Derek Lively looked fantastic. But then when you have the opportunity to go out and not just add one, but add 2 guys that have a lot of experience in the league. They've played in, well, Gafford has played in different situations in both Chicago and Washington. PJ obviously only being drafted by Charlotte. But getting the opportunity to bring in 2 guys who just give you something different and allow you to play faster, play bigger, be more versatile in terms of switchability and just give you more options from a cross-matching perspective, it really opened things up for Dallas. It made them not have to worry about Derek Lively getting into foul trouble or not have to worry about Maxey going up against other guys that are going up against other bigs that he just feels physically outmatched against. Maxey thrives in situations similar to PJ, situations where he gets pulled out onto the perimeter, switched onto an opposing ISO scorer or even their star player, whoever it is. Maxey has proven that he can pick up those guys. And so when you have someone like PJ, who, no disrespect to Maxey, but is a better version of that, on top of what he brings you on the offensive side of the ball, just being able to create his own shot, put the ball on the floor, the floater game, the low post game, which is underrated, that I'm not sure we'll get to see very much of in this Boston series, but I think in the future it's something to keep an eye out for. When you have the opportunity to add 2 of those guys, it can change everything, already adding to what was a very talented group kind of coming into this year. So for Dallas, before the trade deadline, there were a lot of things to like about the team, but you could also feel that they hadn't quite put the pieces together. So then bringing in Gafford and PJ, it wasn't like, oh, you're just adding PJ and Gafford. It's how does that also open up things for other guys or change, your ability to play small, your ability to play big, your ability to play Gafford or have one of Gafford and Lively on the floor at all times if you really want to. So it opened up so many things for Dallas. And even if you want to kind of drill it down in another way, Jaden Hardy, for example, has shown a huge improvement in his playmaking this year. And a huge part of that is getting to play with rim rolling bigs, always having a rim rolling big out on the floor, just his ability to attack in a pick and roll and look for his shot and his finishing ability, but also timing that lob perfectly has been something that has opened things up for the second unit, opened things up for the shooters to allow the team to get hot, and all of those things just sort of come together to allow the team to either build momentum or even come back from big leagues, from big leads if they have to. There have been so many games where they've been down double digits and then come back and won because their ability to just stay the course and have different options all the way up and down the bench. And a lot of that comes from the acquisition of PJ Washington and Daniel Gafford.
Absolutely, and definitely it's paid off big dividends, sealing the deal with Nico Harrison, the general manager of the Mavericks, and of course Mark Cuban rolling the dice at the trade deadline, and say Gafford and Washington have paid off big dividends and certainly made their presence felt in the Western Conference Finals, beating the Timberwolves. I want to talk about another big who was dominant in that series despite suffering an injury, Dereck Lively. Dereck Lively, before getting the injury and even coming back, made his presence felt in the series against Minnesota. Give me your thoughts on Dereck's play against Minnesota and his playoff run.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could talk about Lively all day long. It's been unbelievable to watch him, not just his rookie year, but more specifically on this playoff run. It seems like not just every series, but every single game, he just seems to be getting better and better and just understanding the timing of the role, the decision-making as the pick-and-roll defensive guy, whether to come up, whether to stay back, who to let shoot, who to not let shoot, how to be conservative at certain times with your body to not pick up stupid fouls or to kind of go out and be aggressive and assert your dominance in the paint, depending on the matchup, depending on the scenario. There are so many reads that he has made that may seem so minor, may seem so small, but it is, to be quite frank, it is what has established him as the superior big compared to Daniel Gafford. And I know those two do not at all view their roles as a competition, and that has also been something that's been huge for Dallas. But the way Dereck Lively has improved and has just been so good on the defensive end as a shot blocking presence, even though I should give Gafford his props. He leads the playoffs right now in most blocks. The thing about Lively is that he has so much more of a rim deterring presence for when opposing scorers are trying to attack the paint. He has so much of a deterring presence, and on top of that, he's just as skilled playing out in space when opposing teams try to draw out a mismatch on him, thinking that they're just going to get by him for an easy layup. There have certainly been moments where guys have scored on him, but he seems to never take those as sort of like a confidence-hindering moment. He always is like, he's ready to go. He bounces right back up. You mentioned the injury. That was a super scary moment, and the fact that, he was able to come back after only a couple of days was huge for Dallas, and obviously now this time off between the Western Conference Finals and the Finals has been huge for him. He looks good to go. But yeah, to see the performance and just the basketball IQ and the maturity from a kid who's only 20 years old and is going through a lot in his personal life right now with the loss of his mother, it is wild to see what he's been able to carry and what he's been able to do. So I'm rooting for him. I think he's got to be one of, if not the biggest stories for the Dallas Mavericks this year.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And Derek, you mentioned about him having a tough time in his personal life with the loss of his mother. Mm-hmm. And certainly we're with him on this one, and certainly he's through it all, man. He's balling. He's been balling in this playoff run, and even in the games that he played in the Western Conference Finals against the Timberwolves. So certainly Derek is definitely holding his own, and they're going to need him to hold his own in the series against Boston. All right, I want to talk now just about Jason Kidd. We know Jason Kidd is a tried and true veteran, won a championship with the Mavericks as a player, played for many NBA teams, an all-star and assistant coach, won a championship the year of the bubble as a member of the Lakers, and now he's the head coach of the Mavericks, was rewarded with an extension before the start of the playoffs. Just give me your thoughts on Jason and his playoff run and earning the contract extension.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think with Coach Kidd, I, along with many, have been very critical of the past where he has struggled to make in-game adjustments or even game-to-game adjustments. But this year, I think he, along with the rest of the coaching staff, but he's the head of that snake, and they deserve a lot of credit with how they've been able to make these in-game and game-to-game adjustments, with even just seeing kind of at the start of the year when they got Lively starting, but then they have a significant roster change with the trades that we talked about, and even just seeing someone like Dante Exum come from being just a guy that was signed on a really small deal in free agency. Same goes with Derek Jones Jr., two guys that were signed on very small deals and didn't necessarily have a ton of expectation coming into the season, but then giving them the opportunity to play up into a certain role. And Dante Exum hasn't really done a whole lot in the playoffs, which has been unfortunate for Dallas, but he was a huge part of the regular season for them, and in fact hit a couple of game winners. So I think the coaching staff and Coach Kidd's ability to identify who needs to be on the court and what scenarios, and also how they need to switch things up from a schematic standpoint has been something that has really improved over his time in Dallas and even just his time as a coach in this league. But even more important to that, and I think that this is the thing that really makes this current Mavericks team special, is how they've all come together as a group. And I think when you've got someone like Jason Kidd in charge, who has been widely applauded for his ability to foster and maintain relationships with players, coaches, everyone within the league, I think that is what you see now from this Mavericks team overachieving is a result of that. And he certainly has a big role in the team chemistry, the environment, guys locking into their roles. That starts with leadership. And so a lot of, those understanding your roles and locking into that, of course, players deserve credit for that too. But I think Coach Kidd, his ability to get Luka and Kyrie just locked in as two leaders, but not necessarily number one and number two, or even 1A and 1B. They know whose team it is, but also who's the vocal leader, and that's Kyrie Irving, whereas the best player on the team is Luka Doncic. And so there's this give and take at all levels up and down the roster, and I think it starts with Coach Kidd, which is what earned him that contract extension.
Yeah, it's definitely tough on Coach Kidd's part when you've got a Kyrie Irving and a Luka Doncic. I mean, two alpha males and definitely somebody that are ball-dominant players. And I know Coach Kidd is handling it well so far, and it has definitely paid off big dividends as they're in a big position playing in the NBA Finals. And speaking of who we mentioned, we talked about earlier, Kyrie Irving, right? I mean, one of the most dynamic, one of the most interesting players in the NBA, and when he was acquired a couple of years ago in the trade from Brooklyn, it almost didn't happen. There was possibility of him and LeBron maybe having a reunion with the Lakers. That didn't happen. Then the whole Russell Westbrook deal went down, and Kyrie winds up coming to Dallas. And the first year with him and Luka, a little shaky. Last year, we saw what happened. They didn't qualify for the play-in tournament. What a difference a year makes, right? Kyrie and Luka, they kind of know where they want to be. They're kind of on the same page right now. Just kind of give me your thoughts on Kyrie and his playoff run and the adjustment to sharing the ball with Luka Doncic.
Yeah, I think with Kyrie, it cannot be talked about enough, just his impact on the roster up and down, but also his impact on Luka. Kyrie, and a lot of the players actually talked about it today in their their media press conferences for the finals coverage, is they all talked about Kyrie and how he's the one, like I mentioned, being the vocal leader, but the one that keeps them calm in those games when they get down double digits, or they're missing a bunch of free throws, or their composure just seems a little bit off. Kyrie is the one to reel them back in. Kyrie is the one to kind of get everyone on the same page. If things are going wrong, if they had a couple of bad moments, or maybe they're the away team and the home crowd is just letting them have it. Whatever the case may be, Kyrie will get the players on a huddle. They'll all kind of get on the same page. They'll rally each other together. And for Dallas specifically, there have been players that have come through in the past that after they have left, it has been discussed. And I'm not talking about Kristaps Porzingis here, but there have been other players that have come and gone, and maybe the expectation for them was a little bit high. And then after their departure, it was kind of discussed that there was maybe a bit of a disconnect where their role was. Whereas with this team, there's so much respect for Kyrie Irving, and obviously with Luka, but with how Kyrie has come in and has impacted the team, the organization. He has so many fans within that organization and within the city of Dallas. And so I think he truly feels that everyone is behind him, and that goes back the other way, where all of those players, especially someone I mentioned before, someone like DanHurley, who has taken a leap this year despite not having a consistent role the entire year, him and Kyrie are seemingly joint at the hip. Like, those two, they have such a good relationship. You can see DanHurley implementing certain things into his game that look right out of the Kyrie textbook. And so I think seeing things like that is where you can see the long-term potential of this team, while also seeing what they're capable of in the short term, having gone through so many different changes in the last few years. So I think Kyrie gets most of the credit for that, in my opinion, in addition to Coach Kidd and obviously Luka. But what Kyrie has done for this team cannot be understated. And I think when we see the pressure start to rise in the finals, especially in Boston, where you know it's not exactly going to be a friendly environment, and there's you can just, especially when you also start to get towards the end of the series, one way or the other, if it's close, if it's not, one team's, looking at, shoot, it's win or go home. Those are the moments where you're really going to see Kyrie and this Mavericks team, with how much chemistry and how close they are. You're really going to see them just stay calm and try to get through it. I think Luka has his moments where maybe he gets frustrated or gets stressed, but that's when Kyrie kind of brings everyone back down and they kind of lock in and go. Whereas with Boston, they've got things that they're great at. They've got someone, a veteran on their team who's won a championship in Drew Holiday, but all the pressure is on Boston in this series. I think almost everyone can agree on that, and a lot of the pressure is on Jason Tatum. So in those moments where maybe they end up feeling a lot more of that pressure, on the flip side, you'll have Dallas and Kyrie saying, hey, just stay calm. We know what we need to do. Let's follow the game plan, and that's what they've done all year.
Yeah, they've definitely been following the game plan all year long. And, I mean, when you talk about just a dynamic player and somebody that is just, when he's locked and loaded, is just one of the best, and still one of the best, just to continue to do it. And when he's on, he is on, and we've seen it, especially in this playoff run. And speaking of somebody that's been on it in more ways than one, hey, Luka Doncic, right, the gentleman from Slovenia. I mean, he has trash talking, but backing it up, and certainly the Timberwolves felt that. And Luka, the Magic Johnson Western Conference Finals MVP award winner, definitely deserving of it, man. This has been a playoff run for the ages for Luka. We talked about Kyrie, but, man, what can you say about Luka, right? Give me your thoughts on Luka and his playoff run.
Yeah, I mean, coming out of the gate in that series against Los Angeles, against the Clippers, there's that history, there's that rivalry with LA. And so for Luka, on top of the rivalry to kind of get the playoffs started, he was dealing with a lot of injuries, and he still is dealing with injuries, but I think everyone watching Luka as time has gone on, you can kind of see that he's found a bit of a groove, and he seems to be favoring his knee and certain the injuries that have been reported. He seems to just be doing better overall with them. So with Luka, it's almost like the more the playoffs go on, the more steam he continues to build, and more momentum he continues to build. So with Luka, I think he's so competitive. That's obviously where the trash talk comes in. And Boston, like playing in Boston is no joke. And so I fully expect all of that to just continue to fuel him and for him to know how close he is and know with full confidence that he's the best player in this series. He's going to be on a mission in this finals. And so I think that it's very reasonable to expect that we have not even seen the best of Luka Doncic yet in the playoffs this year. And I think that that's still yet to come for a lot of reasons. But I also think that one thing that may or may not play into his favor, it's something that I'm very anxious to see, especially in game one, is Boston thrives in switching and being such a versatile defense with all these elite perimeter defensive players. But Luka Doncic thrives against defenders that switch against him because he always finds a way to target who he wants to target, whether it's, Porzingis or Horford out in the open floor, or if it's Drew Holiday, who's an elite defender but is a little bit smaller than someone like Jaylen Brown. So I think that there are going to be a lot of different things to keep an eye on with how Luka tries to manipulate Boston's game plan and kind of how Boston bounces back from that. Maybe Boston's up and they don't have to bounce back from it in game one or make any sort of adjustment. But I think with Luka, you're going to be able to see him assess everything that's in front of him and decide what he wants to do, what he needs to change, if he needs to be more aggressive, if he needs to be, I shouldn't even say more passive because he's not going to be passive, and just how he kind of gets the team going because he has a knack for not just getting himself going, but realizing that, hey, I need to lean on Kyrie right now, so I need to get him a couple of easy looks, or we need to establish, our presence in the paint on the offensive end or the offensive glass. I need to get some lobs in there. I need to get the defender on my hip to open up this 2-on-1 and get the easy lob to Lively or Gafford. And so that's what I'm going to be keeping my eye on, and I think he's fully prepared and cannot wait to do it on Boston's home floor in game one.
Yeah, Luka's definitely going to have a tough task because those bigs, like you said, they're very versatile. All of the players are versatile in Boston, not just on the offense and on the defensive side. This is going to be an interesting matchup for Doncic. And we talk about a duo already that we have in Boston with Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, but the dynamic duo, I guess you could say in Dallas with Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. I want to ask you, Lauren, I know the beginning was very rocky and you could tell that they were trying to find their way. Both players are very ball dominant and they're alpha, but these guys can make plays. But this year we've seen it come together and it's continuing to come together. Just kind of give me your thoughts on the relationship between Luka and Kyrie and how things are still being formed.
Yeah, I think from the very beginning last year when they first got together, it was sort of like, how's this going to go? How do we want to play? And there were still a lot of questions. But then coming into this season, it was like, all right, we've had this training camp. We've had the off season to speak a little bit, to get to know each other. Let's hit the ground running and just see how far we can go. And I think it was very clear kind of once the season got started, it was clear how they were going to work. It was just like, how efficient are they going to be? How available are they both going to be? Kind of maybe more questions around the margins there. But with Luka and Kyrie all year long, it's been Luka in the first half, Kyrie in the second half. And I think a lot of Mavs fans have been watching, waiting for the moment where it's like, God, can you guys both go at full speed all the time? And it's not that they're not going full speed, but it's very much one is on and one is off, or like one is in full aggression mode and the other is not. And so I think this series right here, obviously you're at the final stage. This is it. It's no longer a marathon where you've got to think long game. This is it right here. And so I think for them, this could be the time where we do see them both going all in at the same time. We'll have to see how it shakes out, but I think the thing about both of them, and I've mentioned Kyrie's vocal, just everything that his awareness of certain situations, but also his willingness to be vocal in tense situations and be the guy that speaks up. I think what's so kind of perfect about how they fit together is that Luka likes to talk trash to opponents, sure, but outside of that, he's kind of like Jokic in the way that he's like, I don't really want to talk. I want to show up. I want to play basketball. I want to win. I'm very competitive. But outside of that, if you look up Luka interview or Luka moment, somebody will ask him something and he's got like a 3-word answer for them, or like he does not have a lot to say. The dude just wants to play basketball. And Kyrie, they joke about it, those two, but Kyrie will elaborate. He likes to speak. He likes to share his thoughts. He likes to, he's well spoken, and when he talks about his teammates and the coaches and just the environment. And so I think Luka likes deferring to Kyrie there a little bit, being like, you know all this stuff, you know what to say. I don't even want to say it, so you do it. And so I think that those two have an off-the-court understanding of their personalities, of how they fit together, and why, in a way, they need each other. Because I think for Kyrie, coming to Dallas has sort of revived his career in a way with where it was before he came to Dallas. So I think the two of them have a mutual understanding of how they need each other. And for Luka, this is the first opportunity in his career where he's been able to play with someone at the level of a Kyrie Irving, because before Jalen Brunson left, he wasn't the Jalen Brunson that we see today. So, and the same goes for Porzingis, to be quite honest. So I think for Luka, he knows that he needs Kyrie more than anything. So that's what makes them successful in my mind.
Yeah, they definitely feed off of one another. You said that brilliantly, Lauren, and certainly they're going to be put to the test in this series, and we'll get more into it and preview it in just a little bit. But I want to talk about just the city of Dallas for a moment. I want to ask you, what's the city of Dallas, or should I say the Dallas-Fort Worth area's response to the Mavericks being back in the NBA Finals?
Yeah, I think, oh my goodness, the response has been unbelievable because, and not to go too far off the road, but the Dallas Stars, the NHL team, were also in the Western Conference Finals up until that series ended and they unfortunately lost. But just the overall sports following and just the rallying of the city has been on another level. And with the Mavericks, I was actually speaking about this yesterday. The thing about the Mavericks right now is they continue to go in every single series, and every single time the majority of people are picking the other team to beat them. And they have never once looked at that and or even really responded to it. It's almost like, and this is definitely a hindsight 2020 thing, but it's almost like they're walking into the series knowing that one game at a time, they have to do exactly what they need to do, especially they know what they need to do in every game in every series that they've played so far. They've been, like I mentioned, the lower seed. And so they've had those first two games on the road, which is the exact same situation that they have here in Boston. And it's such a unique thing because they've been all year really solid on the road. And so in every single series so far, they've been able to steal at least one game on the road. And then it's a matter of, can you hold down home court? So that's what fascinates me so much about this Boston series, is because the teams match up very well, I think, against each other. I think there's balance. I think it's going to be really interesting, but if Dallas can steal one of those first two games, I think it could get really interesting, because that's kind of been, I don't want to say it's been their game plan, but it almost has felt like, just take one of those first two. Just take one of those first two, and then all of the pressure goes on the team that's favored, and just kind of see how that changes. See if they change their game plan. See if they make adjustments. How drastic are the adjustments even? And so I think Dallas is very comfortable being in that situation, which is where they find themselves again. And after handling the Minnesota series the way they did and kind of putting people on notice, I think that they feel very confident that they have the better duo. I think they feel very confident that they are better at closing games than Boston, even though Boston has arguably four all-star level talents on their team, or 5 all-star level talents on their team, excuse me. And so I think for Dallas, on top of those two things, I think they also feel that they have the better front court in Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively with the way they're playing on the offensive glass as the lob threats on the defensive end. I think they feel better about that, on top of the fact that Porzingis is coming back from an injury, and his answers to how he's been feeling, if he's running with pain, if how he's doing, have been a little bit cryptic. I think Dallas feels very confident in the position that they find themselves in. It's not going to be easy by any means, but like I said, I think they know exactly what they need to do, exactly what areas that they have to attack. They've had a week to prepare, so now it's just a matter of, can you step up? Can you hit the tough shots? Can you hit your free throws, which has been a struggle for them? And are you going to be on top of your defensive rotations, or are you going to be a step slow because you're second-guessing yourself at the highest stage? And I feel confident that they're going to do enough of the right things to potentially steal game 1 or game 2, and then we'll see how it falls from there.
All right, and then, we're in the series now, the 2024 NBA Finals, with the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics, and we've talked about some of the key players, the supporting cast, so to speak, for both teams. But when you have any final series, it's going to come down to the duos. For Dallas, Luka and Kyrie. For Boston, Jason and Jalen. How do you think the duos are going to match up against one another, not just in terms of points, but just in terms of defense and leadership capabilities?
Yeah, I think that's where it could get really interesting, because Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are more skilled in terms of two-way capabilities, but overall across the top, I think Luka and Kyrie are more skilled at taking over a game. I do believe that. And so I think for Luka and Kyrie feeling, and just the Mavericks as a whole feeling confident about the position that they're in, we've seen enough, in my opinion, from Boston to question what happens when they're in a close game and how they can get it done. They struggled to close out games against injured teams that they've played this entire playoff run. You can't obviously count them out by any means, and I'm not doing that at all, but I think what's different about Luka and Kyrie on the defensive end is that as much as Tatum's going to attack Kyrie from time to time, and Luka's going to get caught in certain situations where he's on the defensive end and he's getting worked or whatever you want to call it. On the flip side of that, Jaylen Brown is expected to be guarding Luka Doncic. So how is that going to affect his fatigue level? How much cost is Boston going to have to give up there in terms of him having to chase Luka around? Does he get in foul trouble? Does he get worn out in a long series after a long season so far? Do they switch and try and put Drew Holiday on him just to contain him and try and switch things up a little bit? And if so, does Dallas take advantage of that? And does Luka, work Drew Holiday? So I think where the difference is that Luka and Kyrie are not going to be the primary defenders on either Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown. And if Boston wants to spend the majority of the game on every single offensive possession trying to target those switches just to target those two all game, how much does that take them off of their typical offensive scheme? Whereas, Boston can play 5 out. Boston can move the ball and hit the threes. So, to me, it makes more sense to just focus on your game plan. If the switches are there and the opportunities are there to attack Luka or Kyrie, go for it, try it. But if your game plan switches to where you're trying to make it a point of attack so much to where you're straying away from your game plan, I think that's one area where Boston could potentially fall into a bit of a trap there. Very similarly, with what I was saying about Jaylen Brown being the primary defender against Luka. Does he get fatigued? How does that affect him in late game situations? I think those two things kind of fall into Dallas's. I think they favor Dallas, to be honest with you, and so we'll see what that means for the Mavericks and their defensive matchups, because Boston is very solid with their cross matching and their potential. But like I said, switching against Luka doesn't seem to work very well. So do they just blitz him to get the ball out of his hands? And, what does that look like? Because Dallas is also solid at scoring in those short roll scenarios where they have the bigs making those playmaking decisions. So it's going to be really tough. I think there's going to be a lot of adjustments. But right now, I trust Dallas's duo more.
All right, and you heard it from her. She's LaurenGunn. She loves her Dallas Mavericks, and she's an NBA collaboration partner with Bleacher Report. Lauren, as always, thank you again so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be on the program. Tell everybody where they can find you on social media and any websites. Let them know that as well.
Yes. First, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate, always coming on talking Mavs. You can find me on Twitter at @LaurenGunn, Gunn with 2 N's there, Gunn. And as far as Bleacher Report goes, I will be doing post-game reactions for every single finals game. So sharing my thoughts there, sharing what I see. So come hang out, come share your thoughts as well, and it should be a fun series. So let's have some fun.
Awesome. She's LaurenGunn and definitely loves her Dallas Mavericks and always having a pulse on what's going on with the Dallas Mavericks as well as the NBA. Lauren, again, thank you so much. And if ever you want to come back on, feel free to let us know.
For sure. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
We've got dynamic duos on the Dallas side with Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. And we have the other dynamic duo with the Boston Celtics with Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. To get more into this finals preview, which is expected to be an offensive fireworks, and also to some defense on the side as well. Let's welcome him back to the program. He is the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast and editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, and he's also co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast, Nick Agar-Johnson. Hey, Nick, as always, welcome back, my man.
Ed, thanks so much for having me back on. We've got a fascinating finals matchup ahead of us, and I'm looking forward to breaking it all down for you today.
Oh, man, do we ever, man. This is going to be exciting in the 2024 NBA Finals between the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics. And as always, again, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us on the program. Let's start off with the Western Conference Finals champion, Dallas Mavericks. What an interesting road that they had in their playoff run, specifically in the Western Conference Finals, beating the Minnesota Timberwolves. It was a 5-game series, and the first 2 games were close, but Dallas just came in and they held their own. And, of course, they had a lot of depth, of course, with the duo of Luka and Kyrie. But in your opinion, what were the keys to victory in Dallas becoming the Western Conference Final champions?
Yeah, I was expecting that to be a close-fought series, and certainly it was to start. But, once Dallas took a 3-0 lead, it seemed like things were, pretty much set in stone. But those first 2 games were just back and forth, really exciting affairs. But, ultimately, at times the NBA can be, and basketball can be a game of inches, right? And, Dallas won those first 2 games by a combined 4 points, but they won both the games on Minnesota's home floor. They ended up closing it out on Minnesota's home floor as well. But those first 2 games, if Luka doesn't hit that, buzzer, well, not quite buzzer, if Luka doesn't hit that 3 over Rudy Gobert at the end of that game 2, then maybe we're talking about a series that could have gone 6 or 7 games that, could have been a lot more closely contested. And instead, it goes back to Dallas with the Mavericks up 2-0, and, once they take Game 3, the Timberwolves put on a valiant effort to take Game 4 to make sure it wasn't a sweep. But, again, those first 2 games, if it was a split, it certainly would have been more interesting. But even still, a 4-point margin, it could have been Minnesota walking away from those 2 games in Minnesota up 2-0, and, it would have been a discussion of Minnesota continuing their, seemingly almost destined run through the playoffs, right? And instead, because Luka hit that late 3 to win Game 2, because, Minnesota lost that first game by 3 points, it became something where it almost seemed like it was almost a done deal that Dallas was going to the finals after those first 2 games, but could have gone very differently if just a couple of plays had gone the other way, and maybe we'd be talking about the Minnesota Timberwolves making the finals instead of the Dallas Mavericks. Instead, it was a very easy series win for the Mavericks, but again, it took those really close first 2 games before we got to the point where it seemed like an inevitability that Dallas would end up winning.
Yeah, Dallas, it shocked me as well. I had Minnesota winning this series as well, but a lot of people, I guess that's the beauty of the NBA, as you said. You just never know. And, well, of course, we'll get into Luka and Kyrie and also Jason and Jaylen in just a moment. I want to stay with the trade deadline. Dallas struck gold in the trade deadline, and they were the hottest team in the second half of the season when they acquired Daniel Gafford from the Washington Wizards and also acquiring P.J. Washington from Charlotte. How much have they made a difference in this, not just during the second half season, but in this playoff run in beating Minnesota to become the Western Conference Final champions?
Yeah, we talked about it a little bit on the last episode, but just sort of go into more depth on it. On February 3rd, the Dallas Mavericks lost to the Milwaukee Bucks, 129-117. And at that point, Dallas was 26-23, and they looked like they would be one of those teams who, maybe they can sort of solidify a spot in the 6th seed, but other than that, it seemed quite likely that Dallas was going to end up being, one of those middle-of-the-pack teams that has to fight their way through the play-in to even make it to, the 8th seed, to one of the 8 seeds that, end up going on in the playoffs. And instead, that trade just completely flipped their season on its head. I mean, after that February 3rd game, they won their next 7, on either side of the All-Star break. They ended up closing out the season 24-9 after, that 26-23 start. And, certainly when you look at the season-long statistics for the Dallas Mavericks, they were a middle-of-the-pack team is almost generous. They were a team that, again, was looking for, a sort of outside looking in kind of uphill climb to make it through the play-in. I mean, they look pretty similar to the team that we saw finish 11th in the Western Conference and miss the play-in entirely last season. But those mid-season trades just completely turned this team on its head. They went from having an incredibly talented but, overworked rookie center in Derek Lively, the second being the lob target, being the shot blocker, being the guy who would clean up the interior for the Mavericks. They went from having him be sort of overtaxed in that role to having both him and Daniel Gafford. So the Mavericks essentially had, 45 minutes a game of exceptional center play from those two. And, with P.J. Washington, I mean, he started all but one game for the Mavericks after that trade and just filled a vital role for them as, a forward with size who could stretch the floor, who could play good defense, who would make smart decisions with the ball in his hands, who would help out on the glass. Those two, just adding them essentially to the Dallas rotation without losing all that much in terms of, major minute players for the Mavericks team before that, it completely changed the trajectory of the team. And, you mentioned already they had one of, if not the hottest closes to the season of any team. And, when you look at this playoff run, Luka and Kyrie are certainly the headline grabbers for the Dallas Mavericks. But, again, this was a team that, I'm not sure would have even made it to the first round of the playoffs without those trades. And instead, here we are talking about them as one of the 2 teams in the NBA Finals.
Definitely, and kudos to Dallas management, not just Mark Cuban, but most importantly, Nico Harrison, who really rolled the dice on this deal to get Gafford and Washington, and, of course, with the talent already in Dallas, with the Derrick Jones Jr. and Derek Lively, and, of course, Luka and Kyrie and company really paying off big dividends in the second half of the year and in the playoff run for Dallas to become the Western Conference Finals champions. And let's move over now to the Eastern Conference. So the Boston Celtics, wow. We're going to get into more of their wheeling and dealing in just a moment, but a dominating performance over the Indiana Pacers. Too much offense, too much defense. Too much long-range shooting. Of course, Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, we knew what they were going to bring to the table. And about that backcourt, so underrated with Drew Holiday and Derek White and company, and Peyton Pritchard coming off the bench, and, of course, Al Horford, who's the ageless wonder. Give me your keys to victory for Boston winning another Eastern Conference title.
Yeah, so this was a series that, very similarly to the Western Conference Finals, a couple of things fall ever so slightly differently, and this is a dramatically different series. That Game 1 overtime win by the Celtics was a game that, if the Pacers hadn't really collapsed in the last few minutes of that game, that would have been, Indiana upsetting the Celtics on their home floor, which, maybe makes the rest of the series look more interesting. Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are the headline guys, and you mentioned the vital importance of that Drew Holiday, Derek White backcourt. But, I do want to admit that, something that I was very wrong about in this series was, when we talked about this the last time I was on the program, I brought up, the incredible coaching legacy that Rick Carlisle has. But credit to Joe Mazzulla, he thoroughly outcoached Rick Carlisle in this series, and that's not something you can say very often about Rick Carlisle. And, it was the kind of situation where, again, the Celtics, they have an incredibly deep team. They have all these great players, but, the Pacers struggled with injuries throughout the series, which I'm sure we'll get into as well. But it's not like Boston was without injuries. Kristaps Porzingis is looking to be back for the finals, but he'd missed the whole playoffs essentially up to that point. And, for Joe Mazzulla to figure out, how to run the Celtics rotation without a key guy in Porzingis, for him to be, matched up against Rick Carlisle as the coaching matchup, and for him to so thoroughly win that matchup against, one of the best coaches in the NBA, one of the coaches with the longest legacy in the NBA. Joe Mazzulla has not been a head coach for as long as Rick Carlisle has, but certainly this has to be a feather in his cap and proof of why Joe Mazzulla himself is making a case to be considered as one of the best coaches in the NBA going forward.
You're right about that. I mean, Rick Carlisle is a tried and true veteran, but Joe Mazzulla, he inherited the talent, and he's making the most out of his short time as the head coach of the Boston Celtics, and he's got it right now, and certainly Boston was dominant and clicked on all cylinders. You mentioned about the Pacers' injuries. Wow. Tyrese Halliburton, the hamstring, he just couldn't give it a go, and then everybody was basically beat up from the New York series. That took a lot out of all of the Pacers, and not just Halliburton, but just go more into detail, Nick, about the injuries impacting the series against the Celtics.
Yeah, it's always unfortunate when you have to talk about injuries, but, unfortunately, a lot of the time, the story of who makes the NBA Finals is not just which team was hot at the right time, but, also which team got lucky with, the other team getting hurt. And, there's some argument that, by the time it got to that Game 3 injury for Tyrese Halliburton, the series was not, decided, but certainly leaning very heavily in favor of the Boston Celtics by the time we got to, that game. But, yeah, I mean, ultimately, Andrew Nembhard put on heroic efforts in that Game 3 and Game 4, both of which, again, similar story, were very close, and, Indiana sort of collapsed down the stretch, but, it was games that, especially with Tyrese Halliburton out, a lot of people didn't expect the Pacers to be in those games. And, again, a ton of credit has to go to Andrew Nembhard for stepping up in a major, major way in this series, even though it ultimately didn't end up going the way the Pacers wanted it to. But, even beyond Tyrese Halliburton, I mean, heading into the series, Benedict Mathurin has been out since March with his shoulder injury. He's someone who was a key scoring punch off the bench for the Pacers. And so for them to, have that sort of low-scoring effort in that closeout Game 4 certainly would have been helpful to have Benedict Mathurin on the floor. But, again, I mean, with Tyrese Halliburton, he is one of the young stars of the NBA, and any team that has him out for a significant stretch of time is obviously going to suffer for it. But the Pacers got a lot of great play from Andrew Nembhard. P.J. McConnell had a great Game 4 for them. Similarly, this was a series that, it ended up being a 4-game sweep, but other than a sort of dominant Game 2 effort by the Celtics, 3 of the 4 games in this series could have easily gone the other way if the Pacers had been able to close it out in the fourth quarter. I mean, that Game 4, the Celtics, won Game 3, the Celtics won that fourth quarter, 33-21. If the Pacers can even play them even in that, fourth quarter of Game 3, then we're talking about potentially a different series. But, again, it was sort of expected that the Celtics would beat the Pacers in this series, given how dominant the Celtics have been all season. It's unfortunate that injuries played, a bigger role than we might have liked in that, but I think if you're a Pacers fan, you have to be just over the moon with what this season was for Indiana, just them being so far ahead of schedule already, them getting Pascal Siakam. Hopefully he sticks around long-term in Indiana, but, even getting him at the trade deadline really helped them to make a push for the NBA Finals. And who knows, if Jason Tatum had been the one to get injured instead of Tyrese Halliburton, maybe we would be talking about the Pacers coming back and, taking the series from the Celtics and them being the finals team, rather than sort of the expectation that the Celtics would make it there.
You're right about that, especially with Siakam. We talked about Dallas at the trade deadline, but Indiana, they struck gold as well, getting Pascal Siakam, and that paid off to be big dividends. I mean, the Pacers were a solid team. I mean, being in the in-season tournament, Tyrese Halliburton becoming a star right in front of our very eyes, and then when you add Siakam at the trade deadline, that proved to be wonders for the Pacers. And speaking of trades, They didn't make any trades at the trade deadline, but right before the season started, the Celtics were very bold and made a lot of moves. Drew Holiday was acquired in the trade. Kristaps Porzingis comes over through the whole Marcus Smart deal, and that was a huge deal because Marcus Smart was so beloved in Boston for his toughness and his defense and being the vocal leader of that team. Robert Williams is gone, and now you've got Holiday and Porzingis in Boston. Just kind of give me your thoughts on the impact of that trade happening before the season started.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, maybe people don't sort of properly rate how much better the Celtics team is than last year's team just because last year's team was also very good, right? They took Miami to 7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals. They finished second in the Eastern Conference last season, but they had the best net rating in the NBA, plus 6.5 points per 100 possessions. They had the best expected one-loss record in the NBA last season. So, it's like, okay, they were one of the best teams, if not the best team in the league last season, and they're that again this year. No, this Celtics team is a different animal than, what they were last year. I mean, they set the record for highest offensive rating in NBA history. They had the best net rating in the NBA last season at plus 6.5. They nearly doubled that this season, which is absolutely absurd to even think about, plus 11.6 points per 100 possessions for the Celtics. I mean, all season long, they would have losses that would be, with a couple exceptions, but with really only a couple of exceptions, they would have, losses that would be very close losses that they could have won and wins that were just absolute dominant blowouts over, everybody from the worst teams to the best teams in the NBA. The Celtics this year were a juggernaut in the way that last year's Celtics were not. And, it shows in the playoff record too, right? I mean, they won in 6 games in their first series last year, won in 7 games in their second series last year, lost in 7, as I already mentioned, in the Eastern Conference Finals to Miami Heat last year. They lost 2 games this entire playoff so far, and, they're going in certainly as the favorites against the Dallas Mavericks, even with the improvements that the Dallas Mavericks made at the trade deadline, the Celtics going from right around that same time of, February 3rd was the date I mentioned for the Mavericks. If we go from February 3rd for the Boston Celtics, they were 37-12 at the time, and they finished the season 64-18, right? But, that's sort of talking about how they started to coalesce as the season went along. But in terms of who they added in the offseason, man, I mean, Drew Holiday, it's even as wonderful as Marcus Smart was on the defensive end, Drew Holiday just fills so many gaps for a team, not just defensively, but with his playmaking, with his incredible shooting. Drew Holiday being the 3rd or 4th option for a team offensively, and this season he was really the 5th option for the Celtics offensively. It's such a gift for a team to be able to have someone like Drew Holiday basically focus on everything but scoring. And when he did decide to shoot, he was spectacularly efficient, as was Derek White. And with Kristaps Porzingis, I mean, again, just, having someone else as your tandem with Al Horford is great, but having that someone else be, a 7'3" power forward center type who, shoots 38% from 3-point range on 5 attempts per game, it's incredible what he was able to unlock for the Celtics. Incredible contributions defensively, but really for me, it was what he was able to unlock for this team offensively, averaging 20 points a game for this Celtics team where, again, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are going to be your first and second options, right? This Celtics team was just a juggernaut all season long, and, maybe it doesn't look like it was as dramatic of an improvement because they were so good last year, but the fact that they were so good last year, doesn't take away from the fact that this year they were an entirely different team to try and deal with, and obviously the 2 main guys in that difference between last year and this year were Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis.
Yeah, absolutely. As the saying goes, what a difference a year makes. And certainly, Marcus Smart, again, beloved in Boston, and his defense second to none. But like you said, Drew Holiday comes in and, makes a world of difference. And when you add Kristaps Porzingis, you get another offensive big man. Robert Williams, great in the inside and getting the points in the paint, but Kristaps can really open up the floor in more ways than one. All right, so now let's get to our NBA Finals preview. And, Nick, let's start off with talking about coaches for a moment. We have Joe Mazzulla going up against Jason Kidd. Jason Kidd is an NBA champion, was a part of the Mavericks' last title that they won in 2011 with Dirk Nowitzki and company. Joe Mazzulla, this is his second finals appearance in 3 years as a coach, and he's got a little experience under his belt. And these two guys, I mean, Jason Kidd got an extension, Joe Mazzulla got an extension not too long ago. Just give me your thoughts on both coaches coming into this series.
It's fascinating for me, the coaching matchup in this series, because Jason Kidd is, you know, if there were a most improved coach award, I think Jason Kidd would have won it, you know, this year running away. I mean, the difference between, his season in Brooklyn, which was interesting to say the least, and, him sort of struggling to figure out, how to make the Milwaukee Bucks work in his next stop as a head coach, had a couple of years in between as an assistant coach for the Lakers, was part of the Lakers 2020 championship as an assistant coach. But again, just the difference between Jason Kidd as a coach with the Dallas Mavericks and Jason Kidd as a coach in his first two stops it's remarkable to think about. And, maybe he really did pick up a couple of really key lessons during those couple of years that he was on the Lakers bench as an assistant rather than, essentially starting his coaching career as the head coach of the Brooklyn Nets, which very strange that he was the first of two former Phoenix Suns star Hall of Fame point guards to instantly get their first coaching job as the head coach of the Brooklyn Nets. Kind of strange, the parallel between him and Steve Nash there. But, I mean, again, just the difference in quality of coaching between Jason Kidd in his previous stops and what we've seen from him so far in these first 3 years in Dallas is really something to behold. Whereas, on the other side, Joe Mazzulla came in, joined the Boston Celtics, with a coach with pretty significant expectations, but rather than sort of having the struggles that Jason Kidd did as a coach his first couple years in the league, I mean, last year the Celtics essentially, picked up right where they left off the year before, finished second in the Eastern Conference just like they had the year before under Ime Udoka, but improved their record by 6 games, and then going from there to just the outstanding dominance all season long that the 2023-24 Celtics have put up. It's going to be a fascinating coaching matchup because, again, Jason Kidd is someone who's made serious strides forward as a coach during his time as a head coach in the NBA, and Joe Mazzulla kind of came in when was excellent from day one. And, certainly Jason Kidd has the experience advantage, but as we saw in the last round with Joe Mazzulla against Rick Carlisle, Joe Mazzulla has proven that, he can outcoach some of the, longest tenured, most highly rated coaches in the NBA, right? I mean, he, dominated Eric Spoelstra and the Miami Heat in the first round of the Eastern Conference playoffs this year after losing to them in 7 games last year. He's definitely grown as a coach as well, but he started from such a high point as a coach that, even though Jason Kidd has made those significant strides forward, it's hard for me to bet against Joe Mazzulla as a coach given what he's done for the Celtics this year.
Yeah, it's so tough. And you mentioned, Nick, about Boston just breaking all sorts of offensive records this year. It's going to be a tough act to follow, but Boston's got it. I mean, Dallas has done it, as you stated, with Jason Kidd being improved, but, man, Boston is just clicking on all cylinders this season. I want to talk now just about the bigs for a moment. Boston's got Al Horford and Kristaps Porzingis. We know about Porzingis' injury history. Looks like he should be a full go for this series. And we know Al Horford, as I stated earlier, he's the ageless wonder. Need I say more about him? And then with Dallas, the trade deadline acquiring Daniel Gafford and P.J. Washington. And then, of course, you've got Derrick Jones Jr. and Derek Lively. So just give me your thoughts on the bigs for both teams.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked, quite a bit about the Dallas bigs already, but, I think between Daniel Gafford and Derek Lively sort of locking down the center spot, you have, really you have 48 minutes of exceptional rim running, exceptional shot blocking, and, when you add Maxi Kleber into the mix as well, he hasn't played as much down the stretch, mostly because Daniel Gafford's taken a lot of those minutes, but, Kleber is someone who, makes a little bit more theoretical sense as a matchup against Al Horford. With both of them, you're talking about, guys who contribute in a lot of ways, guys who are excellent shooters from the center position, guys who are great screen setters, guys who have incredibly high feel for the game. I mean, certainly I would say that Al Horford has the advantage over Maxi Kleber. I don't think that's particularly hot take exactly, but, when you combine Maxi Kleber with the incredible, shot blocking prowess, rim protection, and then rim running. I mean, both Gafford and Derek Lively Jr. are exceptional lob targets for Luka. They're both exceptional out in transition. I mean, it's hard not to think that Dallas will at least give the Celtics a run for their money on the interior. I mean, Kristaps Porzingis, coming back for the series is obviously vital, but it'll be interesting to see, how healthy he is, whether he's on a minutes restriction of any kind, whether he's sort of maybe, not as aggressive at taking the ball into the interior, trying not to get injured in this series. It'll be interesting to see, how back to full health Porzingis is when we're talking about this final series. But, man, I mean, this big man matchup would look very different if Dallas hadn't made those trades and they didn't have the big man depth that they have now, where for years and years and years, basically since Tyson Chandler left, the Mavericks have really struggled to get the kind of, incredible rim-running, rim-protecting center. And with having drafted Derek Lively II this year and having brought Daniel Gafford in a trade, now they have two of those guys. And it was always going to be dangerous to pair Luka with one of those guys, but for him to be able to essentially have one of them on the floor for all 48 minutes is maybe, maybe the biggest advantage that Dallas has, positionally speaking.
Yeah, that depth with Dallas and their big guys are really good since the trade deadline. But, man, it could make a big difference if Porzingis is healthy for most of the series. You have him and Horford together. Man, that could mean a world of difference, and certainly something to keep our eyes on in terms of just the big guys for both Dallas and Boston. I want to talk now just about the backcourt for Boston, Jrue Holiday and Derek White. We know they're going to have a tough act to follow with Kyrie Irving and Luka Doncic, or even if they're going to have to go up against maybe a Tim Hardaway Jr. But I want to ask you just about the backcourt specifically with Holiday and White, and not just with their three-point shooting, but with their defense in this series.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to watch. The Celtics, there really isn't any team that has sort of an ideal situation to shut down Luka and Kyrie. I mean, with Luka and Kyrie, you're not going to shut them down. You're only going to slow them down, really. But with Derek White and Jrue Holiday, I mean, between the two of them, they have size at the guard position. They have length at the guard position, and they're two of the best defensive players in the NBA. So really, if you're going to ask any backcourt to attempt to mirror Luka and Kyrie, to try and slow them down, to try and, close off as many passing lanes as they can, to be two players who, especially given the rest of the offensive talents on the Boston Celtics, Jrue and Derek White will almost certainly be asked to focus the vast majority of their energy on the defensive end of the floor. And, it's impossible to, guard Luka and Kyrie in any sort of real way, but if any backcourt is going to be able to slow those two guys down, the Celtics pairing of Jrue Holiday and Derek White would certainly be high on almost anyone's list of who might be able to, not shut them down, but at least contain them a little bit and try and force the rest of the Mavericks to beat them.
Yeah, it's going to be a tough act to follow, man. When you got some guys like Luka and Kyrie, man, it's going to be a tough act to follow because they can score points, and when they get going, there's no turning back. And certainly, let's talk about now Luka and Kyrie, specifically the dynamic duos for both teams. Dallas has Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving. Boston got Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. Listen, both of these gentlemen, these duos, are solidified in their own right. Luka and Kyrie, it took a little time to get it together. Right now, they're on the same page. They're both ball dominant, but they kind of know their lane for the time being. But Jason and Jalen, it's been like a hand in glove. It's been a winning combination since they've been together in Boston. Give me your thoughts on the duos in this series.
I mean, they're going to be the headliners, right? When we can talk all we like about, the matchups on the side, and certainly it's going to be very important to how the series goes, but ultimately I would be shocked if the team with the better duo in this series is not the team that also wins the NBA Finals. And really the only way I could see that happening is, if it's a 6 or 7 game series and Luka and Kyrie are absolutely dominant and just putting together some incredible basketball, but the Celtics, I can see the Celtics' depth sort of wearing down the Mavericks in a way that, in theory, I could see Luka and Kyrie being the better duo, but Boston coming out on top. But that's really sort of an edge case scenario. I think the most likely way that the NBA Finals play out is whichever of those two duos does better is that's going to be the team that wins the NBA Finals. And, from my perspective, I think that Luka and Kyrie is a bit of a stronger duo. I mean, Luka is, pretty much indisputably, I think, at this point, one of the 3 best players in the NBA. And, Kyrie Irving has been, one of the superstars of the NBA for a long time now. I mean, I think that duo has a really incredible chance to put together a finals performance for the ages, but I think that Derek White and Drew Holiday are a much stronger defensive duo to sort of throw at Luka and Kyrie than anything the Mavericks can put together. I mean, the Celtics could also, in theory, stick Jason Tatum on Luka for some possessions. They could have Jaylen Brown on Luka for some possessions. They could have Jaylen Brown on Kyrie for some possessions. The Celtics can mix it up defensively in a way that the Mavericks really can't, and I think it's just going to have to be the Mavericks duo of Luka and Kyrie is just so otherworldly on offense that the Celtics can't contain them. But if you're trying to get in a shootout with a team that just set the record for best offensive rating in NBA history, it's going to be tough. And, I think that the Mavericks have a chance to take this final series on the backs of Luka and Kyrie. But if those two don't have otherworldly performances, I think that the combination of just how good Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown are, combined with the fact that the Mavericks don't have anywhere near as many good options to guard them as the Celtics have options to guard Luka and Kyrie, it'll be fascinating to see how it plays out.
Indeed, it is going to be fascinating, man. And like you said, man, Luka Doncic is at the peak of his powers right now, man. One of the currently best players in the NBA. And before we get into predictions and all that stuff, I want to talk just about the executives for a moment. I mentioned earlier about Nico Harrison really pulling the trigger at the trade deadline to acquire Gafford and Washington, but Brad Stevens, he's done a phenomenal job, and especially before the season started with acquiring Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis. Give me your thoughts on just the executives, specifically with Nico Harrison and, of course, with Mark Cuban on the Dallas side, and then with Boston with Brad Stevens, who is this year's Executive of the Year.
Yeah, I want to start with Brad Stevens, and I think, it's interesting because the Celtics didn't change all that much once the season started, but as you pointed out, they did all the work that they needed to in the offseason. And, for Brad Stevens to look at the Celtics team last year that, again, had the best net rating in basketball, had one of the best records in the NBA, and to figure out, okay, actually, I'm going to trade a fan favorite in Marcus Smart, right? I'm going to make moves to this team, even though they were a team that, went to 7 games in the Eastern Conference Finals and were one of the best regular season teams in basketball last year. It takes a lot of guts to, not blow up that team. Obviously, they kept the core around of the Celtics, but to make really significant moves rather than just saying, yeah, we'll get a couple of minimum contract guys in free agency and keep it pushing, right? Brad Stevens made major moves this offseason, and yeah, the trade deadline was much quieter in Boston than it was in Dallas, but that's because Brad Stevens did all his damage in the offseason. And then flipping to the other side with Nico Harrison and the Dallas Mavericks, I mean, again, we've said it over and over again, but we've said it over and over again because it's really important to emphasize this is just a different Dallas Mavericks team than, not just the Dallas Mavericks team of last year, but the Dallas Mavericks team of January. This is, come February, this is a completely different team, and it showed in the way that they went from, fighting for a potential play-in berth to being one of the best teams in the NBA down the stretch of this season and making it all the way to the NBA Finals. So, in terms of the seasons that they had, I think that Nico Harrison and Brad Stevens have to, be two of the executives who had the best seasons in the NBA this year. But it's really interesting how they went about it in such different ways with, Brad Stevens looking over a team that was incredibly successful last year and saying, no, actually we can make this team even better, versus Nico Harrison, looking what he had with this Dallas Mavericks team that was just a couple games over 500 at the end of January and figured out, no, actually there are a few moves that we really need to make to, turn this team from sort of an also-ran hoping to make it through the play-in to a team that's made it now all the way to the NBA Finals.
Yeah, you hit on all cylinders right there on all those points right there, Nick. And, hey, they had to pull the trigger, and Brad Stevens did what he had to do, and as well as Nico Harrison and the rest of management in Dallas. And I just want to talk now just about the sports fans in both cities. Boston on the East Coast, the competition is ferocious, right? Being on the East Coast, New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, D.C., those cities fight jockeying for position. Boston has to fight amongst those cities. Dallas, being in Texas, that's just a fight within itself when you got Houston, San Antonio, and things of that nature. Just give me your thoughts on how both cities are going to respond in this series.
So I'm more familiar with Boston fans, just having grown up in New York City, having quite vivid memories as a Yankee fan in Yankee Stadium, getting yelled at and, things thrown at me by Boston Celtics fans when I was a 6-year-old child, right? That's, it's a bit unfair to Boston fans, but it's also kind of not. They are one of the most rabid cities in terms of their fan bases across all sports. Between the Red Sox and the Celtics and the Bruins and the Patriots, you have some of the loudest, most loyal, most brash fans anywhere, in the world, much less anywhere, sort of in the NBA landscape. And, on the Dallas side, I think when most people think about Dallas sports, I think the first team to come to mind is probably the Dallas Cowboys, almost certainly the Dallas Cowboys. And, after that, I think is probably, a lot of sort of high school football and, the incredible importance that has. But, you mentioned the Texas rivalry. It is heated between the Mavericks and San Antonio and Houston. And, maybe this is New York bias. Certainly the Texas rivalry seems a bit, gentler is not the right word. I think less rabid. There's, I think, a respect among Texas sports fans. There's sort of the Texas against the world kind of ethos that the state of Texas has had basically since it became a state. But, there's certainly a lot. There's no love lost between any of the Texas teams, and it's all heated rivalries, but there's definitely a respect there. And, on the Boston side of things, again, some of the loudest, most uncontrollable sports fans anywhere in the world come from Boston. So certainly I will expect a raucous environment for all of the games in the Garden in Boston.
Rightfully so. And again, both cities have a lot of pride. One on the East Coast, one in the South, and definitely both cities have a lot of pride, not just culturally, but certainly with their sports. All right, so Nick, the moment of truth is here. Who will win the 2024 NBA Finals, and how many games, and why?
I think I'm going to say Boston Celtics in 6. I think that ultimately, as I said before, if Luka and Kyrie can get to another level beyond the one that they've already shown, they as a duo have shown so much, especially over the last few months. And this Dallas team is a different beast than the Dallas team that we started the season with, the Dallas team that we saw in January. But, even if the Mavericks might have the advantage in terms of the top 2 guys, it's hard to ignore the incredible depth that the Celtics have and the fact that again, they have just run roughshod over the NBA all season long. And so, again, this is a Dallas team that could put a real fight up against the Celtics. I would not be surprised if the series goes 7. I would not be surprised if Luka and Kyrie can find a way to lead Dallas to the championship, but I think that the Celtics just have too much for the Mavericks to be able to handle. And, I think once you get past, the top 2, having Derek White and Drew Holiday and Kristaps Porzingis and Al Horford, the Celtics didn't just set offensive records this year. They were also, ended up as the 3rd best defensive team in the NBA this season. I think the combination of what this Celtics squad can do on both ends of the floor and the number of ways that they can hurt you 3 through 8, 3 through 9, 3 through 10 in the rotation, I just think it'll be too much for Dallas to overcome. So I think it'll be a hard-fought finals. I think there's every chance in the world it could end up going 7 games, but I'm going to have to go with Boston Celtics in 6.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are predicting that. That's my prediction as well. I like Boston to win in 6 as well. I got to ask you, who do you think is going to be the Finals MVP and why?
I think it's probably going to be Jason Tatum. I think, we haven't seen a Finals MVP on the losing team since Jerry West, and, if this series goes 7 games and it's close in Game 7 at halftime when, if I'm remembering correctly, the votes come in for the Finals MVP, then I think there's a chance that Luka could win it. Or, if Kyrie is the one that goes nuclear instead of Luka, I think there's a chance that Kyrie could win. But if I'm picking the Celtics to win the Finals, I almost certainly have to pick a Celtic as the Finals MVP. And, Jaylen Brown did win the Eastern Conference Finals MVP, so, maybe he has another spectacular series, and maybe he could end up being the Finals MVP, but I think Jason Tatum is, he's been the lead guy, even among those 2 incredibly close players in Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. I think the Celtics, if they're going to win the series in 6, I would be surprised if it's not a Celtic taking home the NBA Finals MVP trophy, and I think the 2 contenders for me would be Jaylen Brown and Jason Tatum, but ultimately for me, I'm going to have to side with Jason Tatum as 2024 NBA Finals MVP.
All right, rightfully so, and I think it's going to be one heck of a series in this year's 2024 NBA Finals between the Dallas Mavericks and the Boston Celtics. And you heard it from him. He's Nick Agar-Johnson. He is the host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Nick, as always, thank you so much once again. Tell everybody where they can find you on social media, as well as No Ceilings, Kings Weekly podcast, any websites. Let the listeners know that.
Absolutely. So, first of all, Ed, thank you so much for having me back on the show. Always fun to talk basketball with you. In terms of where people can find all of my work, NoCeilingsNBA.com, No Ceilings TV on YouTube, at No Ceilings NBA on all social media. For Kings Weekly, you can find us on whatever podcast player you might be using, and you can find Kings Weekly social media at Kings Weekly Pod on Twitter, and then you can find me on Twitter at NBA Johnson, and all of my basketball work, whether it's for No Ceilings or for Kings Weekly Pod or this interview with Ed or other interviews that I might be taking a part of, you will be able to find it all on my Twitter page at NBA Johnson.
All right, awesome. And you heard it from him. He's Nick Agar-Johnson, host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Nick, as always, thanks again, my man. If ever you want to come back on, feel free to let us know.
Absolutely, Ed. Thanks so much for having me, and always fun to talk basketball with you, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk basketball with you again soon.
All right, everybody, that's going to do it for this edition of the program. Once again, a big special thank you to LaurenGunn, NBA collaboration partner with the Bleacher Report, and Nick Agar-Johnson, host of the No Ceilings NBA Deep Dives podcast, and editor-in-chief and writer for No Ceilings NBA, and co-host of the Kings Weekly podcast. Until next time, everybody, I'm Ed Robinson, saying so long, and you take care. Hey everybody, thank you so much for tuning into the channel. Remember to click like, share, and subscribe, and thank you for watching.